So first of all, thank you for being here today. I think it was a great discussion. I think it says something for this group that on a Friday afternoon we can still hold you this long. So we appreciate your presence here. I'm a corporate lawyer by training. I don't really know anything about this stuff, although I'm interested in it. And I just realized when I was sitting here listening to these discussions how boring my job is. I really need to get into kind of First Amendment litigation or something like that, where you get to do all these really interesting things. First, we want to, of course, thank the speakers and the participants on the panels today, our sponsors, especially Stoll Reeves and the University of Washington School of Law, the committee that organized this. We're grateful for all their time. I'm not going to do a public presentation to all the speakers. I'm kind of walking around giving them things that I think there may be divergent views on religious faith or where the line should be drawn in our society with how we protect those kinds of rights, but I think everybody can agree that chocolate is a good thing. So for each of our speakers, we're presenting them with a chocolate map of the state of Washington, so they can remember it at least for the airplane ride home before it's gone, I suppose. We will, some of you, I think when you checked in, had a survey to fill out. We'd appreciate it if you'd fill that out if you haven't already and deliver it back to the registration desk. That will help us understand what we can do better. We'd like to do, we exercise a little bit of faith. I'm not sure it was a religious faith or not, but we've exercised faith in dubbing this the first annual Law and Religion Symposium. We'd like to do it again, but we want to know how to do it better. And so if you'll fill out those survey forms and let us know how we did and things that we can do to improve. We do hope to do it in the future, and so as we evaluate this event and what went well and what we could do better and what the interest does, we'll be sure to keep you all updated as to what we're planning to do. After our concluding speaker, we are going to have a reception. So just if you go out this door and down the hall, you'll see all the tables set up. There'll be some hors d'oeuvres and things like that. So we hope that many of you will, even though it's a Friday afternoon, Friday evening, many of you will decide that you want to stay for a few minutes and chat. I know that there was a lot of great questions asked and probably a lot of questions that weren't asked. And so being able to kind of talk to each other and have discussions and perhaps engage with some of the panelists, I think would be really welcome. So please join us after this event down in the hallway for the reception. And finally, I would just express just a personal opinion. I thought that the discussions were interesting and very passionate. And at least one theme for me, at least, as kind of a corporate lawyer who doesn't practice in this area, that was significant. And one message, I guess a theme that I heard come through was, we are all in this together. We may be persons of faith. We may be persons with no religious belief. We may have different views on where the boundary lines should be drawn and how to accommodate people's conscience rights. But we are together, and these kinds of dialogues, in my view, are really helpful in understanding one another and being able to have those kinds of discussions. And I hope that we'll be able to continue these kinds of discussions in a respectful and empathetic manner even after we leave this place. I will quote from my own faith tradition. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The founding prophet of the church has a very famous quote relating to this theme. Joseph Smith said that if it has been demonstrated that I've been willing to die for a Mormon, I'm bold to declare that before heaven, that I am just as ready to die in defending the rights of Presbyterian, a Baptist, or a good man of any denomination. For the same principle which would trample upon the rights of Latter-day Saints would trample upon the rights of the Roman Catholics or of any other denomination who may be unpopular and too weak to defend themselves. It is a love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty to the whole human race. And so those words express better than I can, I think, the importance of these kinds of discussions that we're having. And so, again, we're grateful for you being here and for the speakers and their great contributions. So it's my honor now to introduce our concluding speaker. Elder Von G. Keetch is a member of the First Quorum of the 70 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For those of you who are not LDS, that's a leading council of leadership in the church, oversees the entire church. His current assignment is the Executive Director of the Public Affairs Department. I understand that since his call to serve at church headquarters, he's now a recovering lawyer. Is that how you would describe it? But prior to that, Elder Keetch practiced for more than 25 years at law firm Curtin McConkie in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he was chief outside counsel to the church. And of course, in those kinds of things, it was probably a very broad practice, but certainly represented the church in matters of religious liberty and other kinds of impacts on religious organizations. In one context or another, he's represented virtually every mainline religion in the United States of America, as well as other small churches and nonprofit organizations. Elder Keetch is a graduate of the J. Reuben Clark Law School, the appellation where the Law Society gets its name. He's practiced law at the firm of Sidley and Austin in Washington, D.C., clerked for several federal judges, including as a law clerk for Chief Justice Warren Burger and Justice Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court. Elder Keetch, I think, brings a really unique perspective to these kinds of issues as somebody who has both practiced in this area as well as someone who now represents the church as a ecclesiastical leader and also represents the church in kind of public outreach in his role as Executive Director of the Public Affairs Department. So we're really great to have him here, and we'll turn the time to you, Elder Keetch.
Thanks very much, Matt. I'm really going to put your Friday afternoon diligence to the test, aren't I? Here it is 5 p.m. and you're still sitting in a moot court room. This has to bring back bad memories for those of you that are lawyers, doesn't it? It's 5 p.m. on a Friday. I'm still sitting in the moot court room trying to figure out what the law is. I remember those feelings really well. I am grateful to be here. I am especially grateful to Stoll Reeves and the University of Washington and the J. Reuben Clark Law Society for sponsoring, and what a turnout. I do quite a few of these for the J. Reuben Clark Law Societies across the country, and this turnout is phenomenal. It's great to see you, and hopefully I'll get a chance to meet many of you at the reception afterwards. I was sitting here thinking as Matt was talking, and maybe it's because he was standing up here at the podium, a recent experience flashed back into my mind. I'm a relatively new grandfather. I have 5 grandchildren, the oldest of which just turned 7. And he's a very active young man and very inquisitive. And he asks me a lot what I do, and we talk a lot, and probably a lot of it is way, I try to put it in 7-year-old language. But I had it struck home to me about 3 weeks ago how well he was listening to me. We were in sacrament meeting, and for those of you who aren't LDS, that's our main worship meeting. And I was up on the pulpit, and I happened to be in my grandson's ward, in my daughter's ward. And my grandson wasn't having a very good day in church, and he made it through about the first 45 minutes of the meeting. And then he started to act up, and he pulled his little sister's hair, and his dad got after him a couple of times, and then as happens in our worship meetings a fair amount. Finally, Dad just lost patience with him, kind of picks him up and puts him up over his shoulder, and they're sitting just right down in front of me, about 3 pews from the front, and heads down the aisle with him. Many of you have seen this in your LDS or other worship meetings, right? As he's flung over his dad's shoulders and heading out the door, my little grandson looks up on the stand and sees me. And all of a sudden, out of his mouth come these words: "Help, Grandpa. They're taking away my God-given rights." And then out the door he goes with his dad. That led to a conversation a little later with my daughter, who needed to remind me that some of the ideas I put in my grandson's head probably need to be tempered just a little bit. But when it comes to religious liberty, my grandson may not have had the context or the location right, but he had the principle right. In our religious traditions, be it LDS or otherwise, we certainly agree that religious liberty is a good civil tradition, right? We believe it leads to order and freedom. We would put it out there as a central guiding principle of government. And there is a lot of empirical evidence that shows that's the case. There's a lot of empirical evidence that shows that the greater the religious freedom, the less the public strife there is in a particular nation. But for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and for many other faith traditions, religious freedom goes much deeper. We believe that one of the greatest gifts that God gave to man and woman was the concept of agency, free will. The concept that we would come to this earth and that we would learn to choose good from evil. That we would grow and learn from those experiences. That we would be able, through choice and through deciding which road we were going to travel, to hopefully become better people, to learn more about what right and wrong is, to learn more about the impacts of it. And so the LDS faith tradition teaches that God actually paid a very large price to allow us that freedom to come down and to choose. And of course, we can't have that full range of choices available to us if religious freedom isn't squarely and firmly founded in the nation that we live in. One of my colleagues put it this way. I really like it. He said, "Religious liberty helps preserve the benefits of the atonement of Jesus Christ to each soul because it protects moral agency in matters of faith. It is this agency that is the crucible, the fiery furnace of adversity and decision in which we determine our eternal destinies. It's the crossroads, and sometimes just the cross, where each of us decides whether or not to choose Christ and God and his commandments. Exercising that agency is the very purpose of mortal life. Protecting that crucible, therefore, is vital to salvation and the great plan of happiness as LDS members see it. If the exercise of that agency is compromised, the conditions of our repentance and forgiveness are also compromised." Close quote. So for us, religious liberty, and I know for many of you, religious liberty is much more than just the First Amendment or the important aspect of civil governance in a society. It goes to the very heart of the plan that we believe we're living here, the plan that God has for us. Matt talked about the Joseph Smith quote. I'll give you another one. From the very first Nauvoo City Ordinance, a city larger than the city of Chicago that was set up by the Mormons in about the 1840s. This from its ordinances. In fact, this was the second ordinance enacted in Nauvoo. "Be it ordained by the City Council of the City of Nauvoo that the Catholics, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptisms, Latter-day Saints, Quakers, Episcopals, Universalists, Unitarians, Muslims, all other religious sects or members of no religion denomination whatsoever shall have free toleration and absolutely equal privileges in this city." Close quote. The reason that such an ordinance like that was so important to Joseph Smith, and the reason it was so important in the quotation that Matt read to you, is the belief that we really can't be true human beings if we're not free to choose. And freeing to choose means we have to be able to we need to have freedom to choose good, and we need to have freedom to choose evil, and then that we bear the consequences of those choices. So, with agency as its focus, the Church's understanding of religious freedom is really not extreme libertarian, nor is it minimalist in its approach. It's robust. It aims to preserve legal, social, and cultural space so that people of faith are free to believe, speak, and act according to those beliefs. So very specifically, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what does religious freedom mean? It's the right of all people to hold religious beliefs or no religious belief at all, and express that openly without fear of persecution or punishment or losing equal rights of citizenship. It is the right of people to freely, to be able to choose to change their religion, to teach their faith to their children, to receive and disseminate religious information and to talk and debate about that, to gather with others in worship and discussion and learning, and to participate in ceremonies and practices that they believe further their religion. It's the right of all people to be protected from religious discrimination in employment, housing, and traditional places of public accommodation. It's the right of all people to be protected from religious discrimination that would allow them to operate a business or have a professional license. Additionally, and very importantly, we believe that, and so do you, that religious liberty is not just an individual right. It also adheres to groups of people as they come together and as they found and worship together in churches. So it's the right to form those religious institutions. It's the right to establish doctrine for those institutions and modes of worship, to organize ecclesiastical offices, to determine who clergy should be, to determine membership and employment, and to own property and construct places of worship. Now, religious freedom, and you all know this, can't be absolute. And certainly the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints doesn't believe it's absolute. Limits are appropriate when it's necessary to protect the legal term that you all know, or at least you should have learned in law school, compelling governmental interests, property, health, safety of others. But we believe that such limitations really do need to be compelling and not just a pretense to abridge religious freedom. When the law conflicts with religious freedom, Latter-day Saints believe in obeying the law while seeking the protection of the Constitution and their fundamental rights through the democratic process, the courts, and other democratic means. Now, with that as kind of a basis, I'd like to spend the rest of my time kind of addressing with you the difficult aspects of religious freedom in today's world. In theory, until they start bumping up against other rights, most people are for religious freedom. People from all over the country, Utah, here, other places. If you just ask generally if religious freedom is good, most people will tell you that it's good until it begins to bump up against other rights. And of course, there's nothing bigger right now than when religious liberty tends to bump up against sexual rights. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time kind of giving you my views about. May I suggest to you that it's important for us for those who are very interested in making sure that religious liberty rights are preserved, that we prioritize them. Not all religious liberty rights are created equal. And I brought with me a little diagram, if I can make this work, to kind of give you a feel for the way that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints views kind of this prioritization, if you will. So, if we're going to start prioritizing, we're going to start at the innermost core. These are the most important rights that I would submit to you we have in the religious liberty sphere, okay? First, you've got freedom of members and families to live and express faith, and of a church to operate according to its doctrine. So included in that is the freedom to express beliefs to a willing listener, essentially to have a missionary program, right? The freedom to determine church doctrine, to select clergy, to determine membership criteria. It's the freedom of fathers and mothers and or mothers to teach their religious beliefs in their home to their children. It's the freedom to build temples and meeting houses subject to reasonable zoning requirements. It's the right of free speech and expression in the public square, to talk about controversial matters without being labeled. It's the freedom to petition the government for protections of one's own interests. These are the basic freedoms that are part of American citizenship, and they're really not negotiable. They can't be negotiable if religious freedom is to survive. Next, near the core, are freedom of members not to be excluded from professions or employment based on religion. These include the right not to be punished or retaliated against or excluded because of particular faith views either way, about what marriage should or shouldn't be, about what families should or shouldn't be. America has no religious test for public office, and I submit to you that there should be no religious test for working in the various professions regulated by government. Those with traditional beliefs and those with non-traditional beliefs regarding marriage, family, gender, sexuality shouldn't be excluded from being professional counselors or teachers or lawyers or doctors or any other profession where the government grants licenses, just because the government or those that happen to be in power at the time disagree with their view of family, sexuality, marriage, and so forth. Next concentric circle out is the freedom of church schools and other closely related organizations and nonprofits to operate according to church doctrine and church beliefs. Religious nonprofits, and especially schools, should have the freedom to have employment policies that reflect their beliefs, including the power and to hire based on religious criteria. Religious colleges should have the freedom to establish honor codes and to ask students and faculty who are coming to learn and to teach to abide by those honor codes. Religious charities should have the right to conduct their good works according to the dictates of their own conscience and their religious belief. Now, we get to the yellow, and I'm going to tell you that as we move beyond these core rights into commercial settings, we believe that our expectations of unfettered religious freedom have to be tempered somewhat. That's not because commerce is somehow unimportant or less worthy of protecting religious rights in commerce, but it's because commerce overlaps with a whole bunch of other interests that have existed in our society for a long time. Civil rights is one of those. Right not to be discriminated against in employment or denied service at places because of certain characteristics. So next, still certainly part of religious liberty, but moving towards the outer circles now, is the freedom of small family businesses to operate according to religious beliefs. I want to suggest to you that once we move into the corporate area, the commercial area, claims by business owners for religious freedom are strongest in small, intimate, family business settings, and correspondingly, they're somewhat weaker in large and impersonal corporate settings. It's not to say that those corporate entities don't have some form of religious liberty and freedoms. It's just that we have to be willing to recognize that those are probably not at the core as we talk about how to deal with conflicting rights in society. Finally, there are zones beyond these priorities where claims for religious liberty are significantly weaker. And as an example, freedom of government workers not to perform duties of office that conflict with their religious beliefs. For instance, if it's your job to issue marriage licenses and as an employee in a county clerk's office somewhere in the United States, and if the highest court in the land has told you that certain couples are entitled to those licenses, your freedom to choose whether to issue those licenses for marriages that are contrary to your religious beliefs may be limited based on the circumstances of your office. If there are lots of people there who are willing to do it, then under long established principles, you're entitled to a reasonable accommodation so that you spend more time recording property or doing something else. But if you're the only one, if you're in a little rural county clerk's office in your state or mine that may only have one employee, your ability to refuse to do something that is a required governmental function because of your religious beliefs may be much more limited than it would be if you were at the core. That's simply how we get along in a pluralistic society. In that diverse society with divergent visions of life and morality, conflicts are naturally going to arise, and we've seen some big ones. That's the very nature of religious freedom. The only real reason that principles of religious freedom exist is they've been viewed always as something worth carving out and protecting from otherwise applicable law, right? if the law never impacted religious liberty, we wouldn't have a need to carve out and have exceptions and constitutional protections for them. When those rights conflict, they call upon us to find ways to secure fundamental religious rights while also allowing the protection of rights that others hold dear. And that's what I'd like to focus on next for just a moment. The current conflict between religious freedom and sexual rights, we believe, and I certainly believe, is best addressed through a pluralism approach, or what the church and many others call fairness for all. Let's see if I can explain it to you this way. So if we identify the core religious rights of religious people, and I've suggested to you what those are from my last slide, if we really focus on what the core two or three circles are of religious rights, and then we need to do so, I've chosen LGBT rights here, but you could choose other sexual rights. Those have to be identified and respected as well if pluralism is going to function. That is, both sides have to agree upon what it is that are their core rights, and we can agree on some fairly easily. No one should be fired from their job based on their religion. No one should be fired from their job based on their sexual orientation. No one should be kicked out of their housing because of their religion. No one should be kicked out of their housing based on their sexual orientation. We could go on. These are what I'm going to call kind of existential rights. These are rights at the core that if they're taken away from virtually any group of people, it is difficult for them to exist. So a law that made it impossible to form or come together as a religious organization would impact that organization's very chance to exist. The same for an LGBT group or other groups that are formed. It is, I want to submit to you, with people of good faith who, sometimes we view these clashes as zero-sum games. That is, if I've got the bigger club, I'm going to pound you over the head with it as long as I've got the bigger club. And in jurisdictions where you have the bigger club, you're going to pound me over the head with it as long as you've got the bigger club. And sometimes we're all surprised about how quickly the bigger club shifts from one to the other. We had a fairly big surprise about that almost a year ago now. I want to suggest to you that is not the way to go. That we have to agree that all people living in the United States have core rights. And we have to work together in good faith to identify those. Now, not everything can be core. If everything is core, nothing is core. But as we identify those rights, we speak up and we preserve those rights for everyone. We preserve them for Muslims. We preserve them for Presbyterians and Mormons and Lutherans and Catholics and LGBT people and others. And then we find ourselves next in a zone of compromise, a place where our rights on the outer circles, if you take the core religious rights and the circles that I was drawing for you, there are some that come out far enough that they began to infringe upon the outer rings of others' rights. That is, I want to suggest to you, a place for a classic place that in American pluralism is a zone of compromise. If both sides seek to own that space individually and totally on their own, and if even they try to move over into the other side's core rights, there is no option but for a zero-sum game. None. That is, either in the state of Utah, either religious rights are going to win or others' rights are going to win. And in the state of Washington, either religious rights are going to win or the other rights are going to win. And in two very different states, you can tell right now if it's a zero-sum game which is going to win and which is going to lose. And we find ourselves in a very divided nation over a long period of time, taking turns beating each other over the head with the bigger club. Our suggestion, and the suggestion of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is that we have to find a way to exist together, to protect core rights, identify and protect what those core rights are, and then as our interests overlap with others' rights, to come together in compromise and to talk about how we might be able to work those out. That was the approach that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints sought to take in Utah 2 years ago, where in what is the reddest of red states, a state that I don't think ever would have passed SOGI protections on its own, a group of people came together, church members, but others who weren't members of the church, and said, we want the cultural strife to end here. We do not want to be at each other's throats for the next 2 decades. How can we sit down and recognize each other's core rights and then work on the areas of compromise together? Now, that's not easy. One of my colleagues called that the hard work of citizenship, and that is true. Trying to deal with what happens when rights overlap and what to do in that zone of compromise is not easy. But I want to suggest to you that it is essential if we are truly going to resolve some of these conflicts. Certainly the courts are a place where we can do that. I want to suggest to you as a recovering lawyer that courts are one of the worst places to try to do that. Courts are kind of places of last resort. They're not very good at finding compromise. They're not very good at trying to recognize that both sides may have a good point. By definition in court, there's a winner and there's a loser. And while courts can be very good at setting some of the outer boundaries of our citizenship and our nation, the best place for work to be done is on local levels and at state levels with people of good faith sitting down, as they have for centuries now. In great example of American pluralism, trying to work these things through civilly so that we can live in a nation where people of very different views and very different doctrines, not suggesting here that anyone compromise their doctrine. I'm not suggesting here that anyone compromise what they believe God's law is for them. I'm just suggesting that we have to find a place where all people can live together in peace and be able to follow the path that they believe that God has set out for them. So, to come back to my grandson, I think he really did have it right. Religious liberty is a God-given right. It's a God-given right because it's essential to all men and women exercising their agency and learning to cope and choose right from wrong. The only way to protect what we believe to be that sacred process, a process that allows us to become more like God and to fulfill what we believe is our eternal destiny, is to protect the core elements of religious freedom. And the only way to protect the core elements of religious freedom is to recognize that other people have core elements that they want to have protected too, and to work in cooperation with them to protect both, realizing that that means we're going to have to compromise some at the edges. We have to learn and remember that we honor American pluralism and honor this great society that you and I live in when we protect those core rights, but then work together in peace and in respect despite our differences. Americans have been doing this now since America began. And it's something that I and the LDS Church am confident that we can continue to do with people of good faith like you and others, moving forward and bringing those principles to bear in a difficult but not an impossible to solve area like the ones I've described today. I end where I started. I am grateful for your attention and for your inviting me here and for you thinking about these things. This is where it starts. Good people of faith on both sides of the equation, sitting down and saying, we ought to be able to work this out. We're not going to try to destroy each other. Instead, we're going to try to decide how we can learn to live together in peace and harmony and respect and civility, even though we disagree on this important issue. Thanks very much. It was great to be here.